Stories are a great way for consultants to build trust. They show that you're credible. But why, outside of building trust and showing you're credible, should you be telling stories? Do you know what the science is behind stories? Why stories fail? How stories and AI are related? I use stories quite frequently to explain concepts and to help people learn. But I'm not a storyteller, or let's put it this way, I'm not an expert in storytelling. So what I did is I reached out to somebody, her name is Nora Barry, after reading her book, The Strategy of Story. And we'll talk more about that shortly. And after I read the book, I looked online, and I've known Nora for a number of years. And I saw some of her posts about stories and AI. And I thought she would be an excellent person to help explain why consultants should use stories. But before I formally introduce Nora, let me explain who I am. I'm Laura Burford, and I help independent consultants build successful consulting businesses by focusing on what matters, eliminating things that aren't necessary, focusing on what they want to be known for, who they want to help, and how they want to help them so that they create the right clients and earn consistent revenue. If you want to know more about what I mean by focus on what matters, download the ultimate guide to building a successful consulting business. A link is in the description area. You can find a link to the document on my website, Laura's Consulting Guide. And if you put guide in the comments section, I will make sure you receive a copy of the guide. So now let me introduce you to my good friend, Nora Barry. Hi, Nora. Great to have you
Good
here
morning,
today.
Laura.
I
Thank
really
you.
am happy to have you here. As I said earlier, I met Nora a number of years ago when we were both part of the same organization. And when I saw she had the book, I went and purchased it. First of all, I think I grab every book I can find on storytelling. So I wanted to see what she had to say. And I reached out because Nora is a communication expert and she's a story strategist. She's good at what she does. She's the managing partner of Bridgeview Media, which is a strategic communication consultancy. And I'll provide you links a little later so that you can get in contact with her. She has developed internal and external communication strategies for some top companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Lavina, Red Hat, AstraZeneca, Spark Technologies, among many others. She's written as well for the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Writers, and she's contributed essays to a number of books, including Future Cinema, which was published by MIT Media Press. Actually, her book right now is on Harvard Press. Am I right, Nora?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So not only on Amazon, you can find it on Harvard Press. Early in her career, she launched the first online site for web cinema. She developed and produced several global storytelling projects, including an experimental large scale international video conferencing project, the results of which were presented at, where were they presented, Nora?
CERN,
CERN?
which is
Yeah.
it's a facility in Switzerland, a high-tech facility.
Okay. And most recently, she developed a Gen AI narrative assistant that helps users develop presentations using story structure. Now, I rattled through your background there, Nora, but is there anything else I missed or anything I mispronounced there on the way?
No, that was a pretty comprehensive introduction. Thank you.
Okay. So let's get started and let's have a conversation. And let's start with the first question. Why should a consultant or anyone tell stories?
So what's fascinating, and you and I have spoken of this before, is actually the science behind story and why it works. But there's a number of reasons, primarily why people need to learn how to tell stories to communicate more effectively. Number one, story is how we learn. We are literally born thinking in narrative. Children in their infant weeks and their early months actually have shown signs already of learning and thinking in narrative. It's how we put things together. So when you communicate something in narrative or story, it lowers the barriers to understanding for your audience because you're communicating to them in the way that they think. Second, story is emotionally engaging, so it makes us want to lean in and learn more, and that increases retention. So when you tell somebody something, they actually remember it. And third, story in a face-to-face situation has the ability to actually sync up our brains. And there's a neuroscientist whom I follow, he's out of Princeton, and he's done all these studies on what he calls brain coupling. He also studies communication, and he says story can literally, he has put people into MRIs and had the storyteller's brain waves recorded while recording the brain waves of the people who are listening, and they're synced up, which
Hmm.
is fascinating to me. I mean, that's a pretty compelling reason to tell a story, and it makes you understand why Plato said thousands of years ago, those who tell the stories rule society.
Got it. So it would be interesting to take a consultant client who heard a consultant's story about how they helped somebody succeed and see how that's synced up in an MRI
Yeah.
scan. I'm just talking off the top of my head based on what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, because consultants, when they tell a story, one of the things I say is you have to relate to your client. So the
Yes.
brain syncing, the engaging, the learning is all part of that.
Right. And if people are not engaged, they're not really listening. I mean, communication is a two-way process. And again, the same scientist whom I follow has done a lot of work in this area. And he says communication is a two-way process. Somebody speaks and somebody has to listen in order for that communication to happen. So if you're speaking to your client and they're not understanding and they're not listening, there's no communication going on.
That
And the
loop's
best
not
way to
occurring.
ensure Right. And the best way to ensure that you actually do communicate well is to use story.
One of the things that, and I'm jumping a little here on you, Nor, one of the things that was in your book, and I'm a big fairy tale person, relying on fairy tales to help explain concepts because people have learned fairy tales at growing, many people have learned
Yeah.
fairy tales growing up as a kid. Does that also tie to some of this here as well?
Yeah, I use fairy tales for, and I'm glad you remembered that because it was one of my favorite chapters to write.
Oh,
I use,
actually, it's the chapter that's
there you
marked.
go.
How's that?
I use fairy tales for two different reasons when I'm coaching story. One is to help people understand their audience, and the second is to help people understand concise messaging. So if you look at the history of fairy tales, some of which are maybe 2,000 years old, but at least Cinderella, we have found evidence of Cinderella being at least 1,000 years old, and there are over 1,000 variations on this story. So these stories have been passed down for generations and generations, but what you find is that the core message remains the same.
Mm.
So in Ireland, Cinderella is actually Cinderfella.
Oh,
In
okay.
China, yeah, in China, one of the first versions of Cinderella was found there, and it's not a fairy godmother, it's a magic fish. So there are multiple variations on how these stories are told, but the story really remains the same, or the core message remains the same of Cinderella, which is if you keep believing in yourself and you keep moving forward, you will achieve your dream. So when I began sort of looking at different fairy tales, I began looking at the core messaging and and it just stays the same because I have bookshelves and bookshelves of fairy tales, and no matter which country you're reading the story or the story takes place in, you will find a consistency in that message. So when I try to teach people how to create unified, simplified messaging, I say you have to keep it really, really simple so that no matter how somebody tells your story, because you want, when you finish communicating with someone, you want them to walk out the door and be able to tell your story. They're not going to get every single word right. They're not going to get every single moment captured. But if they can retain that core message, then you're connecting with them.
It's
The
like
other thing I use, go ahead.
no, go. I was gonna say it's like the game Whisper Down the Lane. You want that one
Yes,
core message so that no matter how many times somebody tells your story, there will be variations to it, that's for sure. You want that one message to
yes.
come through.
Yes. And the other thing that I like to use fairy tales for is teaching people how to understand your audience and how to shape your message for different audiences. So the story I always use is The Little Mermaid. And everybody knows the Disney version, right? You know, happy and under the sea dancing, uh, marries
That's
the
the one
prince
I
in the
know.
end. Yes, that's the Disney version. Well, most of us know Disney version, but in the original Hans Christian Andersen version, she never regains her voice. The prince ends up marrying somebody else. She goes along on the ship when they sail out for their honeymoon, and she's so distraught, she commits suicide by throwing herself overboard. And
Oh,
for violating the norms, you know, the norms of civilized life, she is condemned by the sea witch to travel the world for the rest of her eternal life, collecting the tears of sad children. It's the same story in, you know, different endings, but you would never tell that Hans Christian Andersen version to your 4-year-old. You'd give him or her nightmares. But you would tell them the Disney version because it's very happy and upbeat. So same core story. A woman wants to give up her voice because she wants to meet the man she loves. It turns out different ways for different audiences. So you have to understand who your audience is. I always say you have to understand what language they're speaking, and by that I don't mean whether they're Italian or French or German. I mean, what vertical are they in? Because each industry, each vertical has its own jargon. So you have to understand that vernacular and you have to understand who your audience is.
got it. So you would say one of the first things you would tell somebody who's writing a story is figure out who you're writing the story for.
Right. Who's your audience? So I always ask questions. Um, who's your audience? What are you trying to get them to do? And then what do you need to say in order to get them to do that? And then the fourth question is, where do they live? And by that I mean, are you communicating with them in front, you know, in a meeting, in in a room with 500 people, or are you communicating with them via email? Are you communicating with them in a video or via a presentation? Know how you are communicating with them, because the technology of the medium also shapes the experience with the story. You would tell a story differently face to face than you would tell it in text or in a presentation.
Right. Written form versus a video. I know one of the challenges I had when I started doing some videos and teaching online versus in person was changing how I told the story.
Yeah.
Just minor little things. The message was the same, but I had to change my approach.
Yeah. I do believe, and this is in the book as well, you know, I do believe that the technology of the medium, and by technology, I also mean face to face, the technology of the medium really helps shape the story itself, because you can do different things with story in different media.
Okay. Okay. So let me dovetail then into another question. Um, we talked about just a little bit here that you really need to know your audience and how the message needs to be the same no matter how the story gets told, because the story will change based on, I'll say, whispering down the lane, just different people repeating it. You want that one message to come through. Why are some reasons stories fail for people?
That's a good question, because we're bombarded with messages that tell us we need to tell a better story, and most people don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
But stories fail because they're not really stories. It's interesting, in the English language, there's only one word for narrative, but in other languages, there are multiple words for narrative. But so one researcher whom I've read breaks stories down into what he called level one and level two. And the best way to describe level one is an anecdote. Oh, I did this project for this one client and it really solved their needs and they were very happy and we still stay in touch. All right, that's an anecdote. Somebody might say, if you're a consultant, have you worked on this kind of project before? Oh, yes. I had this client who had a similar problem. We managed to work it out and then it resolved their situation. That's a story that's going to fail because it's not a story that is structured. It doesn't have any characters. It doesn't have any plot. It doesn't have any emotional engagement. It doesn't have any drama. There's no payoff in that story. So a level two story is a story that actually follows the structure of story, a narrative arc. And that's the kind of story you need to tell in order to succeed. A level one anecdote, that's going to fail every time. Nobody's going to remember that. But a level two, fully fleshed out, structured story, that's going to survive.
Okay, so a protagonist and an antagonist, an arc.
Okay, so the
I'm
structure of
throwing some
story, and
things.
that's a good question, is there are several elements you need. You need a character because character-driven stories are what create connection with your audience, right? It helps create that emotional engagement. That character it can be a product, it can be a company, it can be a person, it can be an idea. So characters in the course of this kind of storytelling can be not just outside of people. Then the structure is as follows. It's exposition, or what I call scene setting. What's going on? What does the world look like prior to the success you're about to tell them about? What is the inciting incident? What caused, let's say, let me step back a second and say,
Excuse
let's
me.
say you want to create a story with, you're pitching a new client and you want to create a story that lets them know that you have actually accomplished something similar to what they need you to do. So you come in and you do scene setting. Scene setting is, this is what my other client was experiencing. Here's the inciting incident. What caused them to try to change the situation? What incited it? Did they suddenly lose a lot in sales? Was the CEO fired? Did somebody sue them? Did they decide suddenly wake up one day and decide they needed more innovation or something? What was the inciting incident? And then let's say in this case, it would be rising action. How did that story move forward? They decided to bring you in to help solve the problem. And then what were the steps that you took? What were the challenges that you encountered? What were the steps you took as the consultant? What was the climax? What happened when you reached the pinnacle of that? Now, remember, you're bringing them along in a narrative arc. You're creating tension. You're staying focused on the character's trials and tribulations. You have the climax when everything turns around and changes. And then you have falling action, which is when things began to change as a result of that climax. And then you have the resolution, or the happily ever after, which is what the client's world looks like now that you successfully brought them into a new place. So you have to follow the structure of story. There has to be a character. There has to be tension. Tension is what we're all Tension is what we're all looking for in a good story, dramatic tension. I mean, we flip off TV shows, we walk out of movies, we close books that don't engage us because we don't care. It's not going anywhere. There's no tension. We stay when there's tension because we want to know what happened. We want to know how it ends. What happens to that person? What happened to that project? So a classic level two story has that structure, has all those elements: protagonist, antagonist, mentor if you need it, and it has that narrative arc.
So a good story will be written for the right audience. It will tell the problem. I'm using different words here, but explain the problem, the tension, and what's causing you to want to stay there and listen. And then you'll end up understanding how the problem was solved and the resultant benefit. Am I phrasing it?
And
Tell me I'm
yes,
off,
and
please.
you should never be afraid let's say you're building a story about a project that you worked on that ended up very successfully delivering for your client. When you tell the story, never hesitate to talk about the challenges that you had or that the client had on this project, because everybody tries and fails. Everybody struggles. It's about the best stories are about overcoming those challenges. So be frank about the challenges. Maybe you walked in and there was a lot of internal resistance on a team, and then you talk about the skills you used and how you overcame that resistance and brought them along with you so that you were working together. Talk about your failures. We went down this path thinking that option A was absolutely going to deliver the change we needed, and it failed. And so we had to pull back, and here's what we learned. And the reason I say share those struggles, share those failures, is because it allows your audience to hear that you're unafraid to face failure, that you don't walk away when something doesn't work, that you're resilient, you know how to look for other alternatives, you keep going. And so stories of failure that lead to triumph are the best kinds of stories. So don't hesitate to include those.
Okay. No, I think that's great because I tell people, no, you didn't fail. You just learned something different many times
Yeah,
because you learn something that doesn't work, or you have
right,
to just take a different course. That's fine. That's good. That's life.
right. And I think it shows, again, the tensions, the ups and the downs, it builds dramatic tension. It builds empathy with the character because you're struggling along with the character of trying to, hoping that they win out when they do this project or surmount this obstacle. So it's emotional engagement, it's tension, they're staying, they're listening. And then it's up to you to draw in the resolution, in the happily ever after. Okay, here's the new world, here's what we finally achieved. And then you should be able to draw a parallel to your current client's situation. And that's why I think this would be a good fit for you. Or that's why I think I'm the right person to manage your situation, take on your problem. In the business world, the story has to have a goal. And for most of us, that is closing the deal. So you have to be able to tell the story and then draw the analogy from that story to your client.
So when it comes to telling story, consultants should create stories that follow the level two approach that you just mentioned.
Absolutely, follow the structure, because otherwise, again, you're listening to an anecdote, or you're telling your client an anecdote, and anecdotal stories are not, they don't survive, they're not remembered because there's nothing interesting or engaging about them.
Okay. Are there any other reasons why stories fail besides not following the structure and not written for their it's not for the right audience?
So not for the audience, not following the structure. Well, clearly, if you don't tell it the right way, so you should be
Okay.
practiced. Yes, yes, that's a key point, Laura. You should be working on your delivery of that story. I do a lot of coaching for executives before they go on stage at large meetings and sales events. And I had somebody say to me, "Well, what's the trick here? What's the secret sauce?" We met ahead of time, and I said, "There is no secret sauce. You have to prep. You have to
Mm.
rehearse. I mean,
Right.
that's the only thing you have to do. You have to know your lines." And I always, when I get a call and someone says, "Can you help my CEO or whomever?" I say, the first thing I say is, "Where's their presentation? Let me look at their presentation." Because if the presentation is bad, then the delivery is going to be bad because you have no faith in your story or your presentation. So I would say the third reason that stories fail is that people don't prep, they don't get ready. And it's a performance. When we're pitching to clients, it's a performance.
You
Make
have to
no
practice.
make
You
two
have to
ways
get up
about
in
it.
front of the yeah, you
Yeah.
have to practice. Yeah, I remember giving a presentation once and I said it was the worst presentation I ever gave because I was put into a format that did not work for me to present. And no matter how many times I stood in front of the mirror, because at the time I was in front of the mirror, it just did not work. Until I called and said, I know you want me to follow this format, If you want me to
I can't.
present, it's going to have to be my format because this
Yeah.
just is too stilting. I just can't do it.
Yeah. I think you have to be comfortable telling your story. You have to be comfortable with who you are when you're standing up in front of your client or on a Zoom call. You have to be who you are, and you have to be familiar with your story, and you have to tell it in a way that works for you.
Let's move on to my last question, really. Well, next to last question. I think we've answered in some ways the last one. Um, Storytelling and AI. What do you want to say about storytelling? We can't get away from AI. I can't tell you how many emails, and you do too, I'm sure, you receive every day about how you should use AI.
So I got into AI a couple of months ago. I had ignored it for a while because I thought the quality of the writing was so poor. My joke was that it sounded like a 17-year-old girl trying to channel Jane Austen. It does have a tendency towards rather dramatic language, Gen AI. But when I was at a conference and somebody gave a presentation and said that Gen AI, the number one application of Gen AI in the workplace was writing. And that worried me because writing, I mean, in addition to the fact that I'm a writer, among other things, writing is thinking. So if we're not writing, we're not thinking. And so it really led me to take a long, hard look. And I kind of went down the rabbit hole and did a lot of research. And I, Gen AI has been trained on thousands of books, clearly thousands of books. Excuse me, but it doesn't necessarily communicate effectively. It's writing better and better with each iteration that comes out, but it doesn't necessarily communicate effectively. I still find the quality of writing is pretty poor, and there have been studies done where researchers have gone on into companies and given people two samples of emails, one from the CEO and one from Gen AI, and not telling them who wrote it. And people are able to pick out what's been written by Gen AI. I mean, the tone is not there, the voice is not there. But what interested me most was because I do coach leaders and how to tell a better story, I noticed that Gen AI does not intuitively communicate in story. So most of us, when we sit down, if you and I sit down to have a cup of coffee, I might say, "Oh my gosh, you'll never guess what happened to me today." That's scene setting. And then I tell you the inciting incident. The client gave me a call and said X, okay? Rising action. My response was, and then, and then happily ever after, or not so happily ever after. So we intuitively communicate in story structure, even though we seem to forget that when we put together our PowerPoint presentations, but we do intuitively communicate in story. And I found that Gen AI did not intuitively communicate in story. And so I spent about 2.5 months, many evenings, training my chat GPT how to communicate narratively so that when it gives me a report, there is a clear beginning going through the story structure, the narrative, middle, and end. And then I taught it how to take a report or a summary it's generated in story structure and export that into a presentation outline.
Oh,
Because
okay.
again, everybody forgets how to communicate in story when they sit down to write a presentation. And that's one of the workshops I've delivered, how to hold on to and use a storytelling structure when you're creating your presentation. So I created what's called a narrative assistant. But I do have to remind my chat GPT when I go in ahead of time, do you remember the story structure that I taught you before I ask it to do it?
Got it. Well, I had to tell you a little story. I use Chat AI. I use Chat GPT. I was looking for a fairy tale, kid's story, and I put the scenario in that I was looking for. And I know there's a story out there. I just couldn't find it from doing an internet search. So I put in the scenario that I was looking for, and it came back with 5 possible matches. 4 were a little okay. The fifth one looked great. But the fifth one didn't say who originally wrote it. What was the original title of the fairy tale or the kids' book? So I asked. ChatGPT wrote it for me. I was
Yeah.
like, that's not what I asked. I wanted something that was already out there. So I just had to laugh. It was a good story.
Yeah.
It followed the story structure.
It does, but it does tend to, I experienced that multiple times when I was training it. Um, it would rate me, and it doesn't, one of the things I used to train my narrative assistant on was the story of the of Notre Dame Cathedral. The fire, the total
Mm,
destruction, the process of putting it back together, and then the grand reopening in December, because it's a classic story arc, and it kept getting things wrong in the story. It was fascinating. It just couldn't get it right. So I still have mixed feelings. I've had a great time training my chat GPT in how to communicate more effectively, but I don't trust it. I mean, I don't use it to write.
okay. Okay. So, and even if you get a story using ChatGPT or one of the other AI tools, you still have to be able to communicate it.
You
You
still won't be
still
able to what?
communicate it. You still need to be able to tell it.
You still need to be able to tell it, and it's not in your voice. I compare the voice that is in Gen AI to Muzak, right? It's completely scrubbed of anything that makes it different or interesting or engaging. It's a very bland voice.
Okay. Well, let me start closing this up because this has been a great conversation, Nora. Is there something you think I missed in our conversation here that you would like to talk about or mention about story?
I would encourage your audience to use stories for the reasons that we've discussed, the science behind the story, how it lowers barriers to understanding and increases retention, people's ability to remember, but also to really look at and take the time to understand the structure of story, because that's the secret sauce, is the structure of story. It's worked for thousands of years. It will work for you if you actually use the right structure, which of course you can find in my book.
Okay.
But take the time to learn the actual structure of story and then apply it. And yes, that takes work. Um, it does take time, but I guarantee you, once you put that story together, put 3 or 4 stories together for your potential client base, you'll be able to fine tune it, change it, tweak it as you go from client to client, but it will become easier and easier to tell.
So if you have three or four stories, all and each one has a solid one message, you can
Yes.
tweak it easily as you go from client to client. So the one thing
Yes.
you would tell a consultant to do is figure out how to write a story following the story structure. Am I
Yes.
okay? Okay. Well, let me bring this to a close, but I want to make sure everybody is able to, and hopefully this worked. How's that? Is able to get in touch with Nora. I will make sure this information is in the description area, but please grab the information here. And I will make sure that this is a chapter on the video so that you can go right to her information on the video. But her book is great. Help yourself to the book. Connect with her on LinkedIn. And Nora, I'll turn it over to you since this is your slide and your information.
No, feel free to reach out. I've really enjoyed the conversation, but I always enjoy chatting with you, Laura. So thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Nora, for being here. Thank you for listening to this video. If you're interested in understanding more about what I mean by focus on what matters, less is more, go grab the ultimate guide to building a successful consulting business. The link is in the description area. If you put guide in the comments, I will make sure you get copy. And as always, you can find it on my website, Laura's Consulting Guide. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell to be notified when the next interview with somebody is available. And thumbs up is always appreciated. Until the next video, take care.